6 words. That's all it took to destroy her. 6 words in front of 500 witnesses, and Kaelan Ashford didn't even flinch when he said them. I reject you as my mate. The Great Hall of Ironspire went absolutely silent. Not the quiet kind of silence where people are being polite. The other kind. The suffocating kind. The kind that presses down on your chest like a hand. Every single wolf in that room stopped breathing at the exact same moment, and the only sound left in the entire world was the low crackle of the fire in the stone hearth and the sound of Seraphine Vale's heart breaking clean in half. She didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She didn't make a single sound that would give any of them the satisfaction. She stood there in the center of that hall in the simple gray dress she'd worn to the mating ceremony announcement, surrounded by 500 members of the Ironspire pack, with Kaelan Ashford standing 6 feet in front of her, and she held herself absolutely still. Her hands were at her sides. Her spine was straight. Her dark eyes were dry and her face was smooth and controlled, and only Alara Thorne, standing at the very back of the hall, who had known Seraphine her entire life, could see what that stillness was actually costing her. Everything. It was costing her everything. Kaelan looked like a king doing something regrettable but necessary. That was the worst part. There was no cruelty on his face. No contempt. If there had been, it would have been easier to hate him cleanly. Instead there was this composed, resolved expression that somehow communicated that he'd thought about this very carefully and arrived at a decision that was unfortunate but correct, and he was sorry if that was inconvenient for her. He was in full ceremonial dress. Dark gray jacket, silver accents, the Ashford crest embroidered over his left shoulder. His dark hair was neat. His silver eyes were steady. He was the most breathtaking man Seraphine had ever seen in her life, and she despised herself a little for still thinking so, even now, even in this exact moment. The pack elder, a weathered old wolf named Bertram Crane, cleared his throat from his position at the ceremonial podium. His expression suggested he would rather be literally anywhere else on Earth. Alpha Kaelan, he said, his voice carrying that particular careful neutrality of someone navigating a landmine field in the dark. Do you understand the weight of what is being declared in this hall tonight? I do, Kaelan said. His voice was calm. Even. The voice of a man who had decided. And the Omega Seraphine Vale? Bertram turned to her with something that might have been apology in his eyes. Do you receive this declaration? Every head in the hall turned to her. 500 pairs of eyes. Her stepmother Vivian Ashford in the front row with that carefully composed expression that could mean anything and usually meant nothing good. Pack members she'd grown up beside. Wolves who had known her mother. Wolves who would remember this moment and carry it with them and eventually, inevitably, use it as a data point about what she was worth. Seraphine lifted her chin a fraction of an inch. I receive it, she said. Her voice didn't shake. She would have died before she let it shake. Bertram nodded slowly, heavily. Then it is witnessed and recorded. The proposed bond between Alpha Kaelan Ashford of the Ironspire pack and Omega Seraphine Vale is hereby dissolved before formal binding. He didn't say it cheerfully. He didn't say it lightly. He said it the way you might read a verdict you don't personally agree with but are bound by duty to deliver. And that was it. 6 words, a formal acknowledgement, and 21 years of Seraphine Vale's life restructured themselves permanently around a before and an after. She walked out of that hall with her head up. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. She moved with the kind of deliberate, measured grace that took every ounce of strength she had in her body, and she did not look back at Kaelan Ashford once. Not once. Outside, the mountain air hit her like cold water. The night was clear, the sky packed with stars, the forest breathing its slow dark breath around the edges of the compound. She made it to the stone bench beside the eastern garden, the one hidden behind the tall hedgerow that ran along the outer wall, before her legs made their own decision and sat her down without consulting her. She put her hands flat on her knees. She looked at the ground between her feet. She breathed. She didn't cry. She wanted to. There was something enormous pressing outward from behind her sternum. Something that wanted to come apart and spill everywhere, and make the mess that the situation deserved. But she didn't have the luxury of that right now. Not here. Not where anyone could find her. Alara came around the hedge at a near run 2 minutes later, and stopped in front of her, and Seraphine looked up and Alara's expression did the crying for both of them. Sarah, Alara said. Just that. Just her name. The way you say someone's name when there are no words that are going to be adequate and you know it. I'm fine, Seraphine said. You're not fine. I will be. Alara sat down beside her and took her hand, and they stayed there together in the dark for a long time and didn't say anything. Which was exactly right. Exactly what was needed. Because what was there to say? The thing had happened. The hall full of witnesses made sure of that. Whatever Seraphine felt about it, whatever the mate Bond said about it, Kaelan Ashford had stood up in front of his entire pack and said 6 words, and those words were now the most permanent thing about her story. She just didn't know yet that they were also the beginning of something else entirely. Here's what she knew. She knew that the mate Bond had found her at 19 2 years ago, quiet and sudden and undeniable. The first time Kaelan Ashford walked past her in the corridor of the main hall and their eyes met for 3 seconds. She'd felt it like something clicking into place inside her chest. A recognition that went deeper than thought. Her wolf had gone so still it was like the whole world had paused. And then he'd looked away and kept walking, and she'd stood there in the corridor by herself and thought, oh no. She knew that over the following 2 years, despite herself, despite every single intelligent reason she'd assembled against it, the bond had grown, pulled at her, made itself known in ways she couldn't fully ignore. The warmth when he was in the same room. The specific, particular ache when he wasn't. She hadn't pursued it. She wasn't built for pursuing. But she also hadn't been able to fully wall it off the way she'd wanted to, and that failure of containment had been its own private humiliation. She knew that 6 weeks ago, Pack Elder Bertram Crane had announced that per long-standing Ironspire tradition, all unmated wolves of eligible age were to be presented at the mating ceremony announcement, where potential bonds would be formally declared and recognized. It was old custom. Most packs had abandoned it. Ironspire kept it because Ironspire kept everything old. Seraphine had known her name would be on the list. She'd been prepared for the possibility of being matched with a beta, probably someone in the pack's middle ranks, someone strategically sensible. She had not been prepared to walk into that hall and hear Bertram Crane announce, in his slow, formal voice, that Alpha Kaelan Ashford had declared recognition of a potential mate bond with Omega Seraphine Vale. She'd stood there and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Something like hope, like vindication. Like maybe the bond she'd been quietly carrying for 2 years was about to be acknowledged on both sides, finally, properly, in a way that made it real in the world rather than just real inside her own chest. She'd had about 45 seconds of that feeling. Then Kaelan had stepped forward, and his face had been composed and resolved and careful, and he'd said the 6 words. So now she knew something else too. She knew that Kaelan Ashford had felt the bond, recognized it enough to declare it, and then immediately rejected it in the same breath. Which meant he'd known about it and had been carrying it too, probably for a while, and had decided, with whatever cold calculation he ran his inner life on, that she wasn't worth keeping. That was the part that sat lowest. Not the public humiliation. Not the 500 witnesses. But the knowledge that he'd felt what she felt and looked at it and looked at her and chosen to put it down. She sat with Alara on the stone bench until the hall behind them emptied and the sounds of the pack dispersing into the night died away. And then she stood up, squared her shoulders, and decided that she was going to be the most unbothered person in the Ironspire pack. She was going to eat her meals. She was going to train. She was going to do the work she was assigned as the pack's secondary healer, which she was genuinely skilled at, which had nothing to do with Kaelan Ashford. She was going to rebuild the part of her that the rejection had broken quietly and methodically, the way she did everything. She was going to be fine. She had 4 days before the world rearranged itself again. 4 days. And then Magnus Ashford, the former Alpha, Kaelan's father, summoned her to his study. Magnus Ashford was in his late 50s, still formidable, a bigger and slightly rougher version of his eldest son, with the same silver eyes and the same economical way of moving that made you feel watched even when he wasn't looking directly at you. He'd handed the Alpha title to Kaelan 6 months ago at the formal transition ceremony. But nobody in Ironspire Pack was under the illusion that Magnus had stepped back from influence. He'd stepped back from the title. The influence stayed exactly where it had always been. He was sitting behind his desk when Seraphine was shown in, and he gestured at the chair across from him without looking up from the papers he was reading. She sat. She waited. She was good at waiting. Magnus set the papers down and looked at her with those steady silver eyes and said, Without any preamble at all, I've arranged a mating match for you. Seraphine kept her face smooth. That was fast, she said, and was immediately aware that she should probably not have said that out loud. Magnus' expression didn't change. The announcement was made in the hall 4 days ago. Your status is unbound. You're 21 years old and you're an Omega. A formally unbound Omega in an Alpha household is a complexity the pack doesn't need right now. Complexity? She was a complexity. I appreciate that, she said carefully. Who is the match? Magnus held her gaze for a second. Something moved behind his eyes. Not discomfort exactly. More like the brief acknowledgement of a math problem that's technically correct, but produces an answer you're not completely satisfied with. Darian, he said. The room was very quiet. Darian Ashford, Seraphine said. Yes. She sat very still for a moment. Darian, Kaylin's younger brother. The second Ashford son, 20 years old, who she knew primarily as the serious-faced, quietly intense young man she'd seen at packed dinners and formal gatherings, usually at the far end of the table, usually with a book beside his plate that he pretended he wasn't reading. He was built differently from Kaylin. Leaner, a little less imposing in the way that alpha-dominant wolves were imposing, though he carried his own quiet authority. He had the Ashford dark hair but warmer eyes. Dark amber rather than silver. She'd spoken maybe 15 actual sentences to him in her entire life. Does Darian know about this? She asked. He'll be informed. So that was a no. Seraphine took a breath. She thought about her options, which were realistically limited in a way that she found both clarifying and infuriating. She was an Omega in the Ashford household. Her father, the late Edric Vale, had been a mid-rank beta who died when she was 15 and had left her under the pack's general care, which in practice meant Magnus' household. She had no leverage. She had no external allies. She had a very small amount of freedom to push back, and she had to spend it carefully if she was going to spend it at all. And if I have concerns about the arrangement? She asked. Magnus looked at her like she'd asked a mildly interesting but ultimately irrelevant question. You may voice them. I'll consider them. That's not the same as acting on them. No, he agreed evenly. It's not. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had been her father's alpha. This man whose son had just publicly rejected her 4 days ago, and who was now proposing to route her directly into a binding arrangement with that son's younger brother. She wondered if he understood what he was creating. If he'd run those numbers and seen the outcome, or if he'd only run the strategic math and stopped before the human part of the equation. I'll do it, she said. Magnus nodded. He looked, she thought, almost relieved, which was interesting. The arrangement will be formalized in 3 weeks. A private ceremony, not a public announcement. Given the circumstances, he paused fractionally. Given recent events in the hall, a quieter approach seems appropriate. Given the circumstances, given the fact that his eldest son had just humiliated her in front of the whole pack, and now his father was immediately handing her to his second son. Yes, a quieter approach seemed appropriate. Thank you for telling me directly, Seraphine said, which was the closest she could get to what she actually wanted to say while staying within the boundaries of what was survivable. She left the study and walked back to her room in the east wing and sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall. She had agreed to be mated to Darian Ashford, Kaylin's younger brother. In 3 weeks. She needed to think about this very carefully. Elara's response when informed that evening was to sit on the floor with her back against Seraphine's bed and her knees to her chest and say, Magnus has absolutely lost his mind. He hasn't, Seraphine said. From his perspective it's tidy. I'm already in the household. Darian needs a mate. I'm available and I'm familiar and it keeps things internal. It's insane, Sarah. Kaylin just rejected you 4 days ago. I know what it is. What does Darian think? He doesn't know yet apparently. Elara made a sound that communicated several things simultaneously. He's going to find out he's being matched with the woman his brother publicly rejected and he's going to what? Just accept it. I have no idea, Seraphine said honestly. I don't know Darian well enough to know how he'll respond. And what about Kaylin? When he finds out? It doesn't matter what Kaylin thinks, Seraphine said. He made his position very clear in front of 500 witnesses. He doesn't get an opinion on where I go after that. Alara looked at her for a long time. You're really going to do this? What's the alternative? Stay in Magnus' household as an unbound Omega? Get matched with some mid-ranked beta who wants a quiet arrangement? At least Darian is. She stopped. At least he's decent from what I can tell. And he'd be inheriting a substantial position in the pack regardless. It's not a bad arrangement on paper. On paper, Alara repeated. A lot of life gets lived on paper, Seraphine said. There was a particular kind of pragmatism that Seraphine had been building since she was 9 years old, watching her mother's light go out. It wasn't the same as being cold. It wasn't the same as having given up. It was more like having a very clear-eyed relationship with the difference between what you wanted and what was available to you, and understanding that you could survive the gap between those two things if you didn't spend all your energy pretending the gap wasn't there. She wanted love. She wanted a mate who chose her with his whole chest, not his strategic brain. She wanted the bond she'd felt growing for 2 years to be answered with the same fullness she'd felt it with. She wanted to be seen, properly seen, the way her mother never quite was. She wasn't getting that. Not now. Possibly not for a very long time, if ever. But she could survive. She was extraordinarily good at surviving. And in the surviving, sometimes other things grew. Darian Ashford found out about the arrangement 2 days after Magnus told Seraphine. He found out the way most things found out in the Ashford household, which was at the dinner table while everyone was eating, when Magnus set down his fork and addressed his youngest son in a tone that had no inflection in it at all, which was how Magnus always communicated decisions rather than discussions. Seraphine was not at that dinner. She heard about it from Alara, who heard about it from the household senior beta. A woman named Cora who was plugged into the information systems of Ironspire packed the way a tree is plugged into the water table. According to Cora, Darian had gone very still when Magnus made the announcement. He hadn't argued. He hadn't agreed enthusiastically. He had asked in a very quiet, very measured voice, whether Seraphine had been consulted, and when Magnus confirmed that she had been and had agreed to the arrangement, Darian had nodded once and gone back to eating. Kaylin had been at that dinner too. According to Cora, who had been serving at the table and had a direct line of sight to both brothers, Kaylin's fork had stopped moving for approximately 3 seconds when Magnus made the announcement. His expression had not changed. But the 3 seconds of stillness were notable because Kaylin never stopped moving at dinner. He was always doing 3 things at once. Eating, reviewing something in his head, conducting pack business. 3 seconds of stillness from Kaylin Ashford was the equivalent of anyone else flipping the table. Then he'd picked up his fork and continued eating and said nothing. Nothing. That silence sat in Seraphine's chest like a cold stone when Alara told her about it. She poked at it, tried to understand what it meant. Then she made herself stop because it didn't matter. It didn't get to matter. She had decided. She met Darian formally the following morning. Not formally. There was no arranged introductory meeting. No ceremonial awkwardness. It happened in the herb garden on the south side of the compound, where Seraphine went every morning to collect what she needed for her healing work. She was crouched beside the row of bone-set root, her basket beside her, her fingers working through the soil, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path and looked up. Darian Ashford stood at the entrance to the herb garden with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking like a man who had taken a very specific and deliberate route to find himself in this location. He was wearing dark training clothes, his dark hair slightly damp, which meant he'd come from the morning drills in the outer field. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that was already healing, the kind you picked up during sparring, and those dark amber eyes were fixed on her with an expression that was harder to read than she'd expected. She straightened up and faced him. They looked at each other for a moment. "Seraphine," he said. His voice was different from Kaylin's, lower and somewhat warmer, with a carefulness in it that wasn't hesitation but more like deliberateness. Like he chose his words before he spent them. "Darian," she said. He took a breath and walked into the garden and stopped about 4 feet away from her. Close enough to talk properly. Far enough to be respectful. "I wanted to speak with you before the ceremony," he said. "Without anyone else present." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a second. She got the sense he'd been running through versions of this conversation in his head, and wasn't entirely happy with any of them. I want you to know that I understand this isn't what you planned, he said finally. And I'm not going to pretend that the circumstances aren't. A pause. That they aren't complicated. Complicated is one word for them, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile but something adjacent to it. Like appreciation for directness. I also want you to know that I'm not going to make this harder than it already is. Whatever this arrangement looks like going forward, you have my word that I'll treat you with respect. Seraphine looked at him carefully. That's a low bar, she said. This time it was a smile. Small and slightly rueful but genuine. You're right. It is. He met her eyes squarely. Then let me raise it. I know who you are. I've been aware of you in this pack for years. I know you're exceptional at your work. I know you're smarter than most people in this compound give you credit for. And I know what happened in that hall last week was brutal and public and wrong. He said the last word without any particular drama, just as a plain fact. I'm not going to be another person in your life who sees you as a problem to be managed. The directness of it caught her off guard. She was used to people in this pack speaking in layers, saying one thing and meaning another, navigating the social mathematics of hierarchy with every sentence. Darian wasn't doing any of that. He was just saying the thing. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't know exactly what to do with that. Why are you agreeing to this? She asked. You didn't choose it either. He held her gaze. No, but I'm choosing how I approach it. There's a difference. She thought about that. All right, she said after a moment. Then so am I. He nodded. He started to turn then stopped. For what it's worth, he said without looking back at her. What he did in that hall was the worst decision he's made since he came back from Iron Ridge. And I told him so. Then he walked back down the gravel path and left her standing in the herb garden with her basket, her hands smelling of earth and bone-set root, thinking about the fact that Darian Ashford had apparently told his brother directly that the rejection was the worst decision he'd made. She wondered how that conversation had gone. She suspected it had been very quiet and very charged, in the way that all conversations between people who love each other and disagree profoundly tend to be. She didn't let herself wonder too long. She had bone-set root to harvest. The ceremony happened 17 days later on a Tuesday evening. Private. Immediate family and Ilara, who was there at Seraphine's request, and Pack Elder Bertram Crane, who presided with the same careful, neutral dignity he'd presided over the rejection and somehow managed to treat this ceremony with complete solemnity, which Seraphine respected him for. She wore deep green. She'd chosen it deliberately. Not the gray she'd worn to the other announcement. Not the white she probably could have worn. Green because it was her favorite color and she decided that in this specific action, on this specific evening, she was going to be entirely herself. Darian wore black. He stood beside her at the ceremonial stone in the private garden and repeated the words Bertram instructed him to repeat in that quiet, deliberate voice, and when they reached the part where he placed the formal mark on her wrist, his hands were steady and his eyes were on her face rather than on the ritual, which was not standard and which she noticed. She placed the responding mark on his wrist and said her words and felt the bond acknowledge itself. Not with the overwhelming bone-deep recognition of a true mate bond. Nothing like what she'd felt 2 years ago in that corridor when Kaelin walked past. This was quieter. Steadier. Like the difference between a lightning strike and the slow warmth of a fire that you've laid yourself, carefully, deliberately, with the right materials. It was real. It was recognized by her wolf, by the pack bond, by the old magic that ran through all of them. But it was a beginning, not a revelation. A door opening, not a door blown off its hinges. Darian squeezed her hand briefly when it was done. Just once. Grounding. Present. Magnus nodded with satisfaction. Vivian was not in attendance. Ilara was crying in the way she cried at everything meaningful, quickly and quietly and with immediate recovery. Kaelin was not there. He had not been invited. That had been deliberate. Seraphine didn't know if it was Magnus' decision or Darian's, but she noted the absence and filed it away without comment. The days that followed were an education. Not in the uncomfortable way she'd half expected. More in the way that getting to know any genuinely complex person is an education. Darian moved through the world differently from anyone she'd spent significant time with before. where Kaylin was constantly projecting outward, radiating that dense, magnetic alpha energy that made rooms reorganize themselves around him. Darian seemed to move through spaces almost quietly, drawing things inward rather than pushing outward. He noticed things. Small things. The kind of things that only someone paying very close attention would catch. He noticed that she drank her tea at a specific temperature that most people would consider too cold, so he stopped telling the kitchen staff to keep her cup warm. He noticed that she worked most effectively in the early mornings, and would therefore not be the kind of mate who suggested late-night collaborative work. He noticed that she had a particular relationship with silence, that it wasn't distance or anger but thinking, and he matched it rather than trying to fill it. He was also, she discovered, genuinely funny. Not in the performative way of people who need to be seen as funny, in the dry, sideways way of someone who sees the absurdity in things and occasionally lets you see it too briefly before moving on. He was interested in her work. Genuinely, functionally interested. He asked questions about her healing practice that revealed he'd actually paid attention to what healers did, which was unusual. Most wolves in the pack treated the healers the way they treated the cooks. Necessary, appreciated in the abstract, not particularly worth engaging with intellectually. Darian had apparently read 3 separate texts on botanical healing methods, and had specific follow-up questions about the tension between traditional pack healing and the techniques she'd been integrating from outside sources. She found herself talking to him in a way she hadn't talked to anyone except Ilara, with her actual thoughts attached, rather than the managed version of her thoughts. And he listened with his full attention in a way that was slightly disorienting because full attention from someone you're not sure about is a very specific kind of vulnerability. She was careful. She was always careful. But she was also honest because she'd decided to be. 3 weeks after the ceremony, they were in the small sitting room adjacent to the suite of rooms they now shared, she on one end of the low couch with a medical text across her knees, he on the other end with the sheaf of pack governance reports that were his current assignment from Magnus, and she looked up and said, "How are you actually doing with all of this?" Darian looked up from his reports. He considered the question seriously the way he did. "Honestly? Better than I expected," he said. "You? Honestly? Same." She paused. "That surprises me." "Me too," he admitted. They looked at each other for a moment. There was something in the air that was new. Not romantic, not yet, not precisely. But warm. The specific warmth of finding out that someone is more than you initially had data for. She went back to her text. He went back to his reports. Outside the window, the Iron Spire pack went about its evening business, and inside that small sitting room something was growing slowly and quietly that neither of them was yet naming. And then Kaylin walked in. He knocked, which was technically correct and also somehow more disruptive than if he'd just walked straight in. There was something about the knock, about the specific way it was delivered, 2 sharp controlled raps, that carried its own particular energy. Darian looked up and said, "Come in," and Kaylin opened the door. He was still in his working clothes from whatever alpha business he'd been conducting that day. His jacket was slightly open, his dark hair pushed back, and he stood in the doorway of his younger brother's sitting room and took in the scene with those silver eyes that didn't telegraph anything. Seraphine sitting on the couch. Darian on the other end. The casual intimacy of 2 people comfortable enough to occupy the same quiet space. Something moved in Kaylin's expression. Fast. Gone before she could fully identify it. "Darian," he said. "I need the Northern Sector report before morning." "I sent it 2 hours ago," Darian said calmly. "Check your messages." "A beat." "Right." Kaylin's eyes moved to Seraphine, and she held his gaze with the same smooth, neutral expression she'd been perfecting since the night in the hall, and she watched him try to find something to say and not find it. "Seraphine," he said finally, and his voice on her name was strange, too careful, like he was holding it with both hands. "Kaylin," she said, exactly as carefully. He looked at his brother again. "I'll check the messages," he said, and then he closed the door. The room was quiet for a moment. "Sorry," Darian said. "Don't be," she said. "It's his house." "It's your house now too," Darian said, and said it without any performance, just as a fact, and went back to his reports. She sat with that for a moment. "Your house now too." Then she turned her page and kept reading. But she was thinking about the way Kaylin's expression had moved when he saw them. That fast, unguarded thing that was gone before she could name it. She filed it away the way she filed everything. Not to act on. Not to hope from. Just to know. The weeks turned into a month. The month became 2. She and Darian built something. It wasn't the bond she'd carried in silence for 2 years. It wasn't lightning. But it was real. It had texture and weight and shared history that was accumulating daily. He made her laugh. She made him think. They argued twice properly about things that mattered, and both times they resolved it without either of them saying something they had to take back. She worked through the PAC's healing clinic during the days and occasionally went home in the evening and found that he'd put her favorite tea on the table because he'd noticed what time she usually got back. Small things. Consistent things. The material of actual partnership. Her wolf was settling. Not in the resigned way. In the actual physical way of an animal finding that its environment is safe and its needs are being met, and it can therefore stop running contingency plans. There was something profoundly restful about it that she hadn't expected. Kaylin Ashford, across the compound in the main alpha's wing, was not resting. She didn't know this directly. She knew it the way you know things in a pack, through the slow accumulation of observations and the second-hand information that moves through close communities whether you want it to or not. She knew it from Ilara, who told her with a measured expression that Kaylin had been running the morning drills at increasingly punishing intensity, and had been leaving the field later and arriving earlier. She knew it from Cora in the kitchen, who mentioned without particular elaboration that the alpha hadn't been sleeping cleanly for the past several weeks, which Cora had determined from the fact that the lights in his wing stayed on until very late. She knew it from the handful of times she'd been in the main hall for pack gatherings and had noticed, without specifically looking, that Kaylin's attention moved to her and Darian with a frequency and a controlled deliberateness that communicated something specific. He was watching them. Not in an aggressive way. Not in a threatening way. In the way of someone who cannot help it, which in some ways is more uncomfortable than either of those. There is a particular kind of torment that lives in the watching. In the being unable to look away from the thing you gave up. In the seeing with increasing and relentless clarity, what that thing is becoming now that it's no longer yours. Seraphine knew this because she understood the mate bond. She'd carried one for 2 years without being able to talk about it or act on it. She knew exactly what that cost. And the bond she'd felt for Kaylin had not disappeared when he'd said the 6 words. It had gone quiet. Suppressed. It didn't act on her the way it used to, didn't reach for him the way it once had, because her own wolf had understood that the path forward was with Darian now. Had accepted that with a dignity that surprised her. But she wasn't naive enough to think the original recognition had simply ceased to exist. And she suspected, watching Kaylin without specifically watching Kaylin, that his was doing the same thing. Not being carried toward her, because the rejection had formally severed that directionality, but not being quiet either. More like a thing still present, still aware, still registering the loss with that specific grinding awareness that you only get when you've made an irreversible choice that your bones disagree with. She felt no pleasure in this. That was the thing she surprised herself with most. She'd half expected to feel something vindictive about it. Something that said, look what you chose, look what you threw away, look. But it wasn't there. Or if it was there, it was very quiet and she couldn't find it below the other things, the bigger things, the things that were actually about the life she was building with his brother. She told Ilara this one afternoon and Ilara looked at her for a long time and then said, "You have genuinely become a better person than me." "You would feel the same way," Seraphine said. "I absolutely would not," Ilara said with complete conviction. The first real collision happened at 6 weeks. 6 weeks after the ceremony. At the pack's monthly formal gathering in the main hall. Every wolf in the pack, mandatory attendance, 3 hours of pack business and communal meals. Seraphine had been to dozens of them. She knew the format, knew the rhythm, knew where to position herself at the long tables to be present without being the center of attention. She arrived with Darian, which was new. They weren't performing couplehood, weren't staging anything. They just arrived together because that was what made sense now. And they found their seats and the gathering began and it was fine, it was normal, it was just a pack gathering. Until the 3rd hour, when the business portion concluded and the tables were reconfigured for the meal and the pack's social mixing happened naturally, and Seraphine was standing at the far end of the hall talking to Lyra Moss, one of the pack's other healers, about a new sourcing arrangement for Willow Bark, when she became aware of Kaylin approaching. Not dramatically. Not like a confrontation. He was moving through the hall in the way he always moved, that contained authoritative ease, stopping to speak to pack members, doing his alpha work. But he was moving in her direction with the kind of undeflected trajectory that communicated a destination. She finished her sentence to Lyra and waited. He stopped 2 feet from her. Lyra excused herself with the very good social instincts of someone who had read the atmosphere correctly. "How's the willow bark situation?" Kaylin said. She blinked. "Fine," she said. "The northern supplier has better quality." "Good." He was looking at her with those silver eyes, and there was something entirely different in them from the last time they'd been close enough to properly see each other, which had been the night in the hall. She'd been looking at composed and resolved then. Now she was looking at something less managed. Something that had been running too long without enough sleep, and was fraying around the very precise edges he maintained. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. Not warmly. Not coldly. Factually. Something moved in his jaw. A small tightening. "Darian treating you properly?" She held his gaze for a beat that was probably a beat too long. "Exceptionally," she said. The thing in his jaw got smaller and tighter. "Good," he said. "That's good." "It is," she agreed. He seemed to want to say something else and not be able to find it. She waited. She was extraordinarily good at waiting, and she knew it could be maddening to people who weren't. "I wanted to tell you," he started. "Kaylin." Darian's voice behind her, quiet and even. He stepped up beside her and his hand found the small of her back, not possessively, just present, and he looked at his brother with those dark amber eyes that were significantly warmer than his brother's and significantly less readable than they usually were. "Brother." "Darian," Kaylin said. The two brothers looked at each other, and the weight in that exchange was something you could have put your hand on. All that history. All that love and rivalry and brotherhood, and the specific thing that was now between them that hadn't been there before. Seraphine stood between them in the literal sense and felt the pull in 2 directions that she refused to be pulled by. "I should get back to Lyra," she said to no one in particular, and she stepped away from Darian's hand and crossed the hall, and she did not look back, and she focused on breathing evenly for the next 40 seconds while she re-engaged with the willow bark conversation. Later that night, in the sitting room, Darian didn't mention it. He sat with his reports. She sat with her text. After a while he said, without looking up, "You can tell me if it's harder than you're letting on." She thought about that. "It's not as hard as it probably should be," she said honestly. "And that's the part I'm still figuring out." He looked up at that. He looked at her for a moment with those amber eyes. "Do you want to talk about it?" "No," she said. "Then, maybe later." "Whenever," he said, and went back to his reports. She sat there and thought about the word whenever and how much safety was contained in it. There was no urgency in it. No pressure. Just an open door that was going to stay open. She thought about how different that felt from every interaction she'd had with Kaylin, which had always carried this low background tension of unsaid things. She thought about the 6 words in the hall. She thought about the look on Kaylin's face tonight, the fraying edges of the composure, and she thought about the fact that she understood exactly what it felt like to carry something you couldn't act on, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was sorrow for him. Not sympathy. Sorrow. A clean, impersonal grief for someone who had made a terrible choice, and was now living in the exact shape of its consequences. She didn't tell Darian that part. It wasn't his to carry, but she held it herself, privately, and she thought it meant that she was probably becoming a different person through this than she'd been before it, which seemed, given everything, like the only worthwhile outcome available. 3 months in. 3 months and the pack had reorganized around the new reality. Seraphine was not treated as a curiosity anymore. Not the way she'd been in the first few weeks when people looked at her at pack gatherings with that particular expression that combined pity and speculation in approximately equal parts. The pack had adjusted. Pack communities always do. They're built for adaptation because survival requires it. She had gained, unexpectedly and in ways she hadn't engineered, a kind of standing she hadn't had before. Not because of the match with Darian. More because of herself. The healing clinic work gave her visibility and direct, practical value that people felt in their bodies, which is different from the abstract value of political position. She'd treated 7 serious injuries in 3 months, 2 of them complicated enough that less experienced healers would have struggled. She'd also begun training 2 younger pack members in basic first aid, which had been her own initiative and which Magnus had approved with that slight nod that was his version of genuine approval. She was being seen, properly seen, by more people than before. And Darian was watching this happen with something in his expression that she had started to notice and was not yet sure what to do with. It wasn't just respect, though it was that. It was something more particular, more personal. The way he looked at her sometimes across the room at gatherings, before he knew she was looking. There was a quality of attention in it that she hadn't licensed and didn't expect, and that sat in her chest quietly for days before she'd examine it, and then put it down carefully and do something practical instead. She was not going to misread this. She was not going to project. She had a specific history of carrying feelings unrequited, and she was not going to do that again without very clear evidence that the thing she thought she was seeing was actually the thing she was seeing. So she watched. And she was fair to herself about what she saw. What she saw was a man who had agreed to an arranged mating without complaint, and then proceeded to show up for it with his whole self every single day. Who listened when she talked and pushed back when he disagreed and told her the truth even when it wasn't comfortable. Who made space for her wolf to settle and her work to expand and her voice to be heard. Who had walked into a herb garden 4 months ago and told her he wasn't going to be another person in her life who managed her, and had kept that promise with a consistency that was frankly astonishing. Who made her laugh in the dry sideways way, more and more often as the weeks went on. Who had started saving her a specific seat at pack gatherings without announcing it. Who had, last week, sat with her in the healing clinic for 2 hours because she was doing inventory and needed another set of hands, and he had no apparent reason to be there except that she was. She was watching him fall for her. Or perhaps she was watching something that had already fallen, quiet and early, somewhere in the weeks before she'd been paying close enough attention. She couldn't date it. She only knew that it was real and it was being held very carefully, the way she herself held things she didn't want to damage. The sorrow she'd felt for Kaylin was becoming something with more complexity in it. Because the clearer it became what was building with Darian, the clearer it also became what Kaylin had thrown away. Not just her. Not just a bond. The possibility of this. The possibility of being known and choosing someone and having them choose you back, and building something in the dailiness of ordinary life that was more sustaining than any political match could ever be. He'd picked up the political match with Celestia Greywood, which Seraphine knew from pack whispers and didn't need to be told about directly. Celestia was visiting the compound in 2 weeks for an extended stay. The match was being evaluated. Everything was proceeding logically, strategically, in accordance with the plan Kaylin had decided on that night in the hall. And every time Seraphine saw him at pack gatherings, he was watching her and Darian with those frayed silver eyes that weren't managing themselves as well as they used to. The morning Celestia Greywood arrived changed the atmosphere of the compound in ways that were measurable and immediate. She arrived in a convoy of 3 vehicles, which was already a statement. She was 22 tall, with the particular poise of someone who had been being prepared for exactly this kind of moment her entire life. She had reddish gold hair and sharp green eyes, and she moved through the compound's welcome gathering with the smooth efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and intended to do it well. She was impressive. Seraphine acknowledged this to herself without bitterness. She could see exactly what Magnus saw in this match. Celestia Greywood was strategically ideal. She was also, within the first hour of her arrival, looking at Seraphine with a specific attention that went beyond mere social inventory. Something assessor-like. Something that said she'd been briefed, which of course she had, and was now calculating what that briefing meant for her situation. Their first actual conversation happened at the welcome dinner that evening. Seraphine was seated 3 places down from where Celestia was seated beside Kaylin, and Celestia leaned forward during a lull and addressed her directly across the intervening wolf. "You're the healer," Celestia said. "I heard the work you did on the Moro Beta last month. Setting a compound fracture without sedation is not a small thing." Seraphine looked at her. The interest was genuine, she assessed quickly. Not performance. "He wouldn't accept sedation," she said. "It wasn't particularly impressive. It was just necessary." "Doing necessary things well is exactly what impressive means," Celestia said, and looked at her for another moment with those sharp green eyes, and then leaned back and returned her attention to Kaylin. Seraphine absorbed that exchange and sat with it. Celestia Greywood was, she concluded, Probably a good person. That was an uncomfortable thing to conclude under the circumstances, but she was committed to being fair. She looked down the table at Kaylin, who was conversing with Celestia with that polished, composed ease that he brought to all formal situations. He looked like what he was, an alpha in command of his environment doing his work. Then he looked up and his gaze caught hers for a fraction of a second, and that fraying thing was there again. Underneath all the composure, like a tear in fabric that keeps pulling wider no matter how many times you try to press it flat. She looked away. Darian, beside her, put his hand over hers briefly on the table. She turned her hand over and let her fingers close around his and held on for a moment. It was Alara who put the thing she hadn't said out loud into words, which was always Alara's particular function in her life. They were sitting in the clinic after hours, for months into the arrangement, Alara perched on one of the examination tables, her feet swinging, watching Seraphine organize the supply shelf with the particular aggressive tidiness of someone who is thinking hard about something. "You love him," Alara said. Seraphine did not stop organizing. "That's a large word." "It's a precise word," Alara said. "The right size for the thing I'm describing." Seraphine put a jar of salve down on its designated shelf. She straightened it so the label faced forward. She looked at it for a moment. "I think I might be falling for him," she said carefully. "I'm not ready to put the other word on it yet." "Okay," Alara said, with the tone of someone who believes you entirely, and is also completely certain you'll be using the other word within the month. "It's different from," Seraphine stopped, "from what you felt before." "For the other one?" "Yes." She turned and looked at Alara. "It doesn't hit like that did. It's not that specific electric recognition. It's more like waking up and realizing you've been warm for a long time without noticing when the cold stopped." Alara looked at her with an expression that was three things at once: genuinely moved, deeply satisfied, and quietly, privately furious on her behalf that it had taken this particular route to get here. "Seraphine." "What?" "That's better, you know. That's actually better than the lightning version." "I know," Seraphine said. "I'm still figuring out what to do with that." What she did with it, in the immediate, was continue being herself. She didn't announce anything. She didn't perform anything. She just continued being present in their shared space and honest in their conversations, and herself, fully herself, the person she'd been quietly building for 21 years. And Darian, who was paying attention, noticed. The way he noticed everything. He found her one evening in the herb garden, which had become something of their place without either of them officially designating it. She was checking on a new planting of yarrow she'd put in the previous week, crouched between the rows, her hands in the soil, and she heard his footsteps on the gravel and felt the warm recognition of him before she looked up. He crouched down beside her, which was not something most people did when they could stand above you and conduct a conversation from there. He looked at the yarrow. "Coming in well," he said. "Yarrow is forgiving," she said. "Planted in bad conditions and it finds a way anyway." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her rather than at the yarrow. "Seraphine," he said. She looked at him. He was close, crouched beside her in the growing dark, his amber eyes warm in the low evening light. He looked like a man who had been very patient and was coming to the end of a very specific kind of waiting. "I'm falling for you," he said. Direct. No performance. Just the fact of it, offered to her cleanly. She looked at him for a long moment and thought about all the ways she could respond to this carefully. All the ways she could qualify it and protect herself and manage the gap between what she felt and what she was willing to acknowledge. Then she thought about what she was actually building deliberately with this man. And she thought about what she'd decided in the clinic with Alara. About the difference between the lightning and the warmth. "I know," she said. "I'm falling for you too." Something in his expression shifted. Not surprised exactly. Like a man watching something he'd hoped was real be confirmed as real. He reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, carefully, and then dropped his hand. "All right," he said. The same word he always used, but it meant something different now. It meant I was hoping for that, and now that I have it I intend to carry it well. They stayed in the herb garden until the dark came in properly and the yarrow was just a shape against the soil, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with bonds or brothers or public halls or arranged ceremonies, and she realized that she'd been warm for a very long time and she hadn't noticed when the cold stopped. Kaylin noticed the change. She didn't know how. She didn't think she and Darian were dramatically different in their public behavior. They'd always been present with each other, had always occupied shared space with a natural ease. But something in the shift between them must have registered in the way the pack's collective attention registers things, through frequency and quality, and that indefinable but unmistakable change in the air around two people who are no longer just being careful with each other and are now being something more than that. She knew Kaylin noticed because his watching changed. It went from the controlled, fraying kind to something rawer, less managed. She caught him at 3 separate pack gatherings in the following 2 weeks, looking at her and Darian with an expression that she would have described, in her most honest inventory, as grief. Not anger. Not jealousy exactly, though the jealousy was in there too. But primarily grief, the specific kind that belongs to choices you cannot unmake. He was also, according to what drifted through the pack's information networks, not functioning particularly smoothly in other aspects of his alpha work. Decisions were getting delayed. Meetings ran over. The patience he usually brought to interpack diplomacy was fraying publicly enough that 2 of the senior betas had apparently requested a private meeting with Magnus, which was an extremely unusual thing to do and which communicated significant concern. Celestia Greywood, for her part, had noticed too. She was too sharp not to. She was visiting for 3 weeks in total, and Seraphine had spoken with her 3 times in those weeks, enough to have confirmed her initial read. Celestia was intelligent, capable, gracious, and was conducting her own assessment of the situation with green eyes that missed nothing. On her last day, Celestia found Seraphine in the clinic during a quiet hour. She came in without drama, closed the door behind her, and sat down in the chair across from Seraphine's workstation with the air of a woman who had something to say and had allocated the time to say it. Seraphine set down what she was working on and looked at her. "I'm declining the match," Celestia said. Seraphine blinked. "Why are you telling me?" "Because I want you to know it's not about you," Celestia said. "Or not about you the way you might think. It's because he doesn't look at me the way he looks at you, and I have no interest in being someone's second choice for the rest of my life." She said this without rancor, with a clear-eyed practicality that Seraphine recognized and respected. "I also think he knows that. I think he agreed to this match because he was trying to convince himself of something, and it hasn't worked." Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." "Don't be," Celestia said. "Better to know now." She stood. "You've built something real with the younger one. Anyone with eyes can see it. Don't let the older ones regret complicate that." Then she picked up her jacket and left the clinic, and 2 hours later her convoy was moving down the mountain road away from Iron Spire. The quiet after her departure had a texture to it, like the air before weather. Kaylin knew Celestia had declined. Of course he knew. And whatever calculations he'd been running, whatever careful architecture of logic he'd been building for months to house the decision he'd made in that hall, Celestia's departure was something structural coming loose. He came to the clinic. She was alone. It was after hours. She was doing the late supply inventory, which she did every 2 weeks and which was, she admitted to herself, the kind of quiet, methodical work she did when she was processing something complicated. He knocked with those 2 sharp raps. She said, "Come in." He stood in the doorway of the clinic and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and they were, for the first time since the night in the hall, genuinely alone. "Seraphine," he said, and her name in his voice was still that specific, careful, 2-handed thing, still held like something precious and slightly painful. "Kaylin," she said. He walked in and stopped in the center of the room, and his hands went into his pockets in the way they did when he was trying to look more contained than he was. He looked at the shelves, the organized rows of jars and linens, then back at her. "I made a mistake," he said. She set down her clipboard. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You did." He looked like the word landed. "I knew what the bond was. I felt it long before the announcement. And He stopped. He was very still, in the way of someone who has run the numbers every possible way and keeps getting the same answer, the one they didn't want. "I chose strategy over it. I convinced myself it was the right move for the pack." "I know," she said. "I didn't understand." He stopped again. "What?" she asked, and her voice was even and genuine, not cold, not sharp. "Just asking." "What it would cost," he said. I understood the theory of the cost. I didn't understand it when I'd be watching him. He cut himself off again. His jaw was doing the tightening thing. Watching you both. What you're building. He met her eyes. He looks at you the way he stopped. Breathe. I was wrong. About all of it. And I think I knew I was wrong before I said the words in that hall. And I said them anyway because I thought the pack needed. Kaylin, she said, and her voice was quiet and level and not unkind. What do you want from me right now? The question landed in the room like a stone dropping into still water. He looked at her. I don't know, he said, and it was the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had been her whole world in silence for 2 years. Whose 6 words had broken something in her. Who she had watched carry the weight of his own wrong choice with increasing invisible difficulty. And who was standing in her clinic with his hands in his pockets and his careful composure finally fully gone, looking at her with something that was absolutely and undeniably love and absolutely and undeniably too late. I can't give you what you're standing there hoping for, she said. I think you know that. He nodded. Once. Tightly. What I'm building with Darian is real, she said. It's not what I would have chosen a year ago. But it's mine. It's ours. And I'm not going to set it aside because you've arrived at a conclusion you could have arrived at before you stood in that hall. Something in his face tightened and then released the way a held breath releases. Painful but necessary. I know, he said. I don't hate you, she said. I want to be clear about that. I understand what you did and why you did it. But understanding something is not the same as it being reversible. No, he said quietly. It's not. They stood there for a moment in the quiet clinic with all of it between them. The 2 years of a bond she'd carried alone. The 6 words. The gray dress and the 500 witnesses. Darian in the herb garden. The warmth that had replaced the cold. I hope, she said, that you find a match that's real. Not strategic. Real. She paused and she was honest because she always was. You're capable of more than you showed that night. I think you know that too. He looked at her with those silver eyes and she could see the thing he was not going to say out loud because saying it out loud would be wrong in all the ways that mattered. Take care of yourself, she said. And treat your brother well. She paused again. He's better than you know. Kaylin's eyes closed briefly. Something moved across his face that was private and painful. Then he opened them and looked at her and nodded once. Congratulations, he said, and the word was thick with everything it contained. On who you've become. Then he walked out of the clinic and closed the door and she stood alone in her organized, quiet room and breathed very carefully for about 30 seconds. Then she picked up her clipboard and finished the inventory. Darian was awake when she got back. He was in the sitting room with a book he probably wasn't reading, and he looked up when she came in and read her face with that particular attention of his that caught everything. You all right? He asked. Yes, she said and meant it. He held up one arm and she crossed the room and sat beside him and he put his arm around her and she leaned into his side and he didn't ask anything else, just held on. And outside the window the stars were out over the Iron Spire Mountains and the forest breathed its slow dark breath and inside the room something that had been growing for months was quietly, thoroughly, irrevocably real. She thought about what Celestia had said. Don't let the older ones regret complicate that. She thought about the yarrow she'd planted in the herb garden. The forgiving plant that found a way in bad conditions. She thought about her mother in the East Wing, going slowly dim for want of being seen. She thought about the girl in the gray dress standing in the hall with her spine straight and her hands at her sides and her heart broken in half, deciding in the midst of that not to collapse. She thought about all of it and none of it changed what was true now. What was warm now? What was hers? Darian, she said. He said into her hair. I love you, she said. He went very still for a moment. Then she felt him exhale slow and full. The way you exhale when something you've been holding for a long time finally has somewhere to land. I love you too, he said. And his voice was steady and clear and unheld and she knew it had been true for longer than he'd been able to say it. And that was fine because she was saying it now. And now was when it mattered. The pack adjusted. Packs always do. Kaylin adjusted too. Slower. More painfully. But he did it. She watched him do it over the following months with a kind of respect she hadn't expected to feel. He stopped coming to the clinic. He stopped appearing at the edges of their shared spaces with those fraying silver eyes. He did his alpha work with increasing steadiness, and he and Darian rebuilt the particular closeness of brotherhood that the situation had strained, which she knew because Darian came home from a training session 6 months after the clinic conversation and said simply, "Kaylin apologized to me today." And she looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them needed to say anything more about it. Kaylin matched eventually with a wolf named Marin Salas, a beta from a northern pack who had the quiet strength of someone who had built themselves from the inside out, rather than being built by circumstance. Seraphine met her at the formal announcement gathering, and assessed her in 30 seconds and thought good. She thought he's going to have to learn to be seen by her. And it's going to be uncomfortable for him, and it's going to be exactly what he needs. Marin looked at Seraphine across the hall with a calm, clear gaze that communicated she knew the shape of the history and had made her own peace with it. They nodded at each other. Brief. Mutual. Sufficient. And then Seraphine turned back to Darian, who was beside her, always beside her now, who had one hand light at the small of her back and was mid-conversation with Alara about something she'd missed the beginning of, and she stepped back into that conversation and into that warmth and into her life. The yarrow came in thick and strong that spring. She harvested it in the early mornings while the dew was still on it, the best time, when the oils were concentrated and the light was clean and the mountains held the cold of the night just long enough to make you grateful for what was warm. She thought sometimes about the 6 words, about the hall, about the 500 witnesses and the gray dress and the before and after. She thought about how she'd stood there with her spine straight and received the thing and walked out with her head up, and then gone around the back of the hedge and sat down on the stone bench and breathed. She thought about how you could be broken in half and still know, even in the breaking, that you were not going to stop. That you were built of something that found a way in bad conditions. That somewhere ahead of you, in a herb garden at dawn or a sitting room at night or a clinic after hours, the thing that was meant for you was already growing. She thought about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is the beginning of the right thing. How sometimes the door that gets slammed is the one you didn't actually need to go through. She thought about all of it, hands in the soil, the yarrow coming up green and persistent and strong. And then she picked up her basket and went home to her husband and her life and the love that had grown, quiet and real and warm, out of the ruins of someone else's mistake. The morning was cold and clear and the forest breathed and the pack moved through its ordinary morning, and Seraphine Vale walked through her gates and into her kitchen and found that Darian had put the tea on before she got back, at exactly the right temperature, because he knew when she'd return, because he always knew, because that was the kind of attention that built a life from the inside out. She stood in the doorway for a second. Then she went in. The door closed behind her. And in the hall of Ironspire Pack, 500 wolves went about their morning, and the story of the 6 words became just one of the many stories the old wolves told. And in every version of it, the part everyone remembered was not the rejection, though they always started there. The part everyone remembered was what happened after. The girl in the gray dress who walked out with her head up, and went on to build something that the man who rejected her spent the rest of his life knowing he had forfeited. Not as punishment, not as revenge, just as the truth of what she was, which was never something that needed his permission to be extraordinary. She'd always been extraordinary. She was just finally at last somewhere that could see it. Okay, so if you made it all the way to the end of this story, you already know what kind of person you are. You're the one who doesn't leave. You're the one who stays for the whole thing. And those are exactly the kind of people I make these videos for. If this story hit you the way it hit me writing it, drop a like right now because it genuinely helps more people find it. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button because I have more stories exactly like this one coming every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Last thing, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. Doesn't matter if it's 2 in the morning and you're under your covers or on your lunch break or avoiding something you're supposed to be doing. Tell me where you are. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next one.